Hi, welcome to the Home Cinema Guide channel. I'm Jeff Meyer, retired AV calibrator engineer. And in part 4 here, I'll be discussing how to adjust the color of white in your display. In the previous parts, we have gone through how to adjust things like sharpness and focusing and geometry and other key settings in your product to get you to where now you can start making the finer adjustments to really getting that color up to speed. We'll be using an iPhone or an iPad like this as your reference color device instead of trying to use some light meter, which many people have trouble doing properly. With this, you'll be able to use your own eyes and judge, well, am I close or not, and make those adjustments appropriately in your display. At this point, you'll want to go into the quality settings on YouTube as shown and make sure that the YouTube file being played is set to 1080p on the streaming device that you're using. You'll also want to have a piece of paper and pencil or pen available to be able to record your settings as you go along, just in case you make a change that you want to reverse where you found, oh, I like that better before. That way I can go back and set it to what I had before instead of having to try to recreate that situation which you liked at one point and tried to fine tune and ended up making things worse in the process. You'll also in your iPhone or iPad want to go into the color settings on this device and set it such that night mode and true tone are off. This is extremely important when you're adjusting color in your display. If you don't do this, the phone is not going to come close to the appropriate color that you should be using to match it to your display. You'll also want to make sure that you dim your room lights down so that the color of the walls is not interfering with your color judgment, along with any reflections on the display should be minimized at this point as well. In a projection system, ambient light in the room will also affect color, so you want to make sure the room is as dark as you can possibly get it if you have a projection system that you're using. At the beginning of this, we'll want to start by matching the light output level on your phone to your display. And you'll be using the SMPTE color bars shown here. You should try to match the bright white box at the bottom as closely as you can on your phone to what is being shown on the display. You'll do this by adjusting the light output on your phone if possible. If you need to adjust the display light output, you should go in and adjust that as well, but at this point I would try to just make the adjustment on the phone to get it close, or on your iPad. I'm going to go into now a little bit of description of why we're starting with white instead of other colors. And this is true whether you're using this method or another to adjust your display. It's really important to get the color of white correct first, because everything in the color image is built upon the color of white. And so if you are off in white, it becomes extremely difficult to tell what adjustments you need to make with the other colors. So you need to really try to get white as close as you possibly can to being accurate, because it will shift every other color. Because the way a color image is built, it's essentially layered on top of white. So if you have an image, think of it as a black and white image at the heart of it with color layered on top to create that final color image that you're looking for. And so if your black and white is off, you're not going to end up with the color looking right overall. But if you don't separate this process, everything is so interactive from a color standpoint that it'll be nearly impossible for you to get good color on your display. So it's key to try to break these things up into steps that are manageable so that when you're making these adjustments, that you can key in on the factors that primarily affect the adjustment that you're making. And then when you move on to the next adjustment, you're not being fooled by things that were possibly very wrong in the adjustments before. You want to make sure that you get the color of white in this process as close as possible before moving on to making the other color adjustments required in your display. We're going to start out adjusting white by starting with the black point of the display. And so when you're looking at a display, there's going to be a point that sets the minimum light output for information coming from the source, and then there's going to be a value that the maximum light output coming from the source that the display can support. The brightness setting or the black level in a display is adjusted with this brightness control or black level control in the display, and that's going to set the dimmest image that you're possibly going to see from your product based on what's coming from the source. You should look at your iPhone or iPad now to see an example of what a brightness error looks like. To start with, we're going to look at a brightness and contrast test pattern here. And what you want to try to do is adjust the brightness or black level setting in your display such that the gray bar shown on the far left is as bright as you can get it without making the background glow more. And this can be pretty tricky to do, but you need to try and look at it very carefully and make adjustments in very small increments until you see the background glow, and then darken it down until you don't see it change anymore. But you still want to be able to see that dark gray bar as well. If you clip it to where that's not visible, you've gone too far. So you need to bring it back up again and go back and forth with the brightness adjustment until you get that black level as dark as you can get it, but not so low that you're clipping information out. The next image we're going to look at is this scene from Casino Royale that shows a very dark black and white scene with James Bond sitting in a chair. And you want to look at the black bars on the borders and how they match up with the black background in the image. The bars should always be at least as dark as anything in the scene. You'll also want to look at the near black information on the buttons and things like that and compare that to your phone and try to see if that's fairly close. It can be really difficult at this point to get it really close because gamma will affect this as well. And that's one of the tricks in this, is that brightness and gamma interact. And so at this point, just get it close. Don't try to get it perfect. If you happen to luck out and setting brightness, you get it perfect and you're not clipping anything and everything looks really good near black, well, you've just lucked out. But if it doesn't match perfectly at this point, don't panic, because we're going to look at gamma, which has an effect in the near black as well, and you'll need to revisit brightness when you start adjusting gamma as well. And also, when you're making these brightness adjustments, you really shouldn't be moving it more than about a value of 5 or 10 from the default value in the display. Anything more than that is pretty suspicious, and you want to look at it pretty carefully. You may also find that you need to go back and set that data level to something different than you chose before on the HDMI. So when you set the HDMI levels on your source, your display, to 16 to 235 or something like that, if you're ending up with really unusual values for brightness compared to what the default level was, you might want to revisit those settings because something is probably amiss. Most displays on the market, the brightness setting is usually very close to the default value and typically within 5 points of where the default value is at, either plus or minus. The next setting we're going to look at is contrast, and this determines the peak light output within the range of the display. And it's very important to try to maximize this because that's going to set the contrast of your display. So if you artificially lower contrast down, the ratio between the darkest part of the image and the brightest part of the image will not be as high as the display can sustain. And I see a lot of mistakes in this area where people lower the contrast down to dim the display. That's something that maybe you had to do with a plasma or something like that. But today on OLEDs or LED LCDs or projectors, there's other mechanisms available to change the light output of the display. And you really do not want to use the contrast or picture level on your display to adjust the light output. You need to look at what sets that level for your display of the range of it and adjust that appropriately to try to maximize that as much as possible, because that's what maintains the pop in the image. If you have the brightness set too high, that will make everything look washed out and poor. And if you have the brightness set too low, it'll look clipped. When you have that right and you have the contrast right, then the image will have the maximum pop possible from your display and really give you a much more pleasing image than you could if you misset these. So you need to be very careful to try to get these set correctly. You should look at your iPhone or iPad now to see an example of what contrast errors look like. We're going to start out adjusting contrast by looking at the bright white bar on the right hand of the display. It should show two segments in it, the one on the right being brighter than the one on the left. And you'll want to adjust your contrast such that there's no apparent color in that bar, and also so that you see two segments. Might want to start out by raising the contrast up until the two segments disappear or the color changes relative to the white bar in the center. When things are correct, you should see a small step in brightness from right to left, and then the box in the middle being basically the same color as the bright bar on the right. If that's not the case, you need to adjust contrast until that occurs. You may also need to revisit brightness at this point as well. Some displays, you'll have interactions between contrast and brightness, and so when you adjust this, you need to go back, look at the brightness setting, and see how that's working, and just make sure that things haven't moved a little bit on you as you move contrast around. When you get contrast set to where you think it's best, you may want to back down on it just a couple of ticks to give you a little more headroom. This test pattern limits out at 235 on the 8-bit value, and 255 is actually a legal value. And so if you drop contrast a couple of ticks, you may give yourself a little more headroom. You may not want to do this if you have a projector when light output is very precious. So if it's a projector, I'd stick with this. If it's a flat panel, you might drop it a couple of ticks just to give you some headroom so that you don't clip the above white information that can be found on some material. You need to match the iPhone or iPad again to your display using the SMPTE color bars. At this point, we'll start adjusting the actual color of white. And to do this, you'll be using your phone to compare the test pattern of a cross-stepped gray bar from your phone to the display. And what you'll want to do is try to get this to match as close as possible. You need to look at your iPhone or iPad now to see an example of what color temperature errors look like. The target here is to hit something called D65, and when you look at the settings in your display, it'll be labeled something like color temperature, white balance, something like that. And you'll look for a value of warm, warm to, neutral, D65, 6500K, things like that. Those are values that are typically going to be close to the right one. And at this point, you want to take your phone, hold it up, look at the test pattern here, and compare it to what you see on your display. And make the appropriate setting adjustments on the color temperature in your display until you get something that's as close as possible to what's on the phone. You're not going to exactly match it at this point, but you want to pick something that's pretty close. If you're going to err on any side, I would choose something on the display that's slightly bluer than what you see on the phone, if nothing really matches it, because a blue error is much more acceptable than any other. This is the reason that many displays are shipped with a blue error in them, because if you shipped a display on the green or red side or something like that, it just doesn't look very good. Where a blue error tends to be pretty forgiving and is pretty hard to see if it's fairly small. We need to match the iPhone or iPad again to your display using the SMPTE color bars. We're going to move on now to adjusting what I think is really the most important parameter and most difficult one to get correct in your display, and actually is one of the least understood in the display as well. And that's something called gamma. What gamma is the transfer function between the signal input and light output on your display. And here, what happens is a signal comes in your display, and then there's a table or function in there that determines how that's translated into light output. And if the table that you're using is running too dark, what'll happen is that there won't be enough white put into the image. And that's going to determine how saturated it looks as well. And so think of it like mixing paint. So essentially what happens is you've got color image layered on top of white, and if you don't have enough white in there, then you end up with too bold a color from the color that's blended in, and it's going to be really overly saturated. The other thing can happen as well when gamma's running too bright. Now I've got too much white thrown into my paint, and everything is really undersaturated and looks washed out. And then on top of it, if you don't have the right gamma function, things can get like overly edgy, hard to see the near blacks, can look washed out. So it sort of affects the sharpness of the display as well. So gamma is one of these things that affects how sharp the display looks, what the color of the image is, the shading of the image. It's extremely important to get correct. And so you want to pay really close attention to this setting in your display. What you're going to do now is we're going to take the SMPTE color bars and we're going to look at the dark gray bar on the bottom right of this test pattern. And you want to go into your display and find where the base gamma setting is. And you should see something labeled gamma, and it should have a value like 2.2, BT 1886, something like that. Or it may be labeled low, medium, or high gamma. And you'll want to go in and select between the different gamma values and choose the one where the dark gray bar here on the bottom of this test pattern is as close in brightness as you can get it to what it shows on your phone or your iPad. If you end up changing the gamma, you'll want to go back and recheck the brightness and contrast settings, and then recheck the gamma setting again, and try to find the gamma value that comes as close as possible to that darkest bar. If you can't match it exactly, I would choose one that's a little dimmer instead of one that's a little brighter, because you really don't want to have it look washed out. And so if you need to make a compromise here, I would choose something a little bit darker than what the bar is showing on the phone on your display. We'll also want to now look at the black and white scene from Casino Royale and see how that looks with the different gamma settings and how close you are. And you might try to pick a compromise here again. And we'll also look at the colored scene from Casino Royale and judge it by looking at how dark the image is below his glasses. So there's a shadow below the glasses that he's wearing, and you want to look at that relative brightness of that shadow relative to the rest of his face, and try to get that very close to what you see on your phone or iPad. And you need to do that by selecting between the different gamma curves and then going back and forth potentially between brightness and contrast settings and using those test patterns until you end up with a gamma setting that gets you as close as possible on the black and white scene of Casino Royale and the colored scene on Casino Royale, looking at the shadow below the glasses, and then also looking at the test pattern on the SMPTE color bars. At this point, we'll look at making maybe some fine adjustments to the gamma if you're not happy with just selecting one of the default gamma curves. If you have an LG display or a JVC projector, these have some ability in them to make adjustments to fine-tune the gamma curve to try to come closer to these test patterns and images available here. If you have an LG display, there's a 20-point adjustment that you can use to adjust this curve. And I would go in and start out by just adjusting values near black between 20 and 5 and try to move those in increments of 5 until you get something in the near black that's close, and then maybe make adjustments in increments of 5 from values of 20 up to 90. I wouldn't make adjustments above 90 or below 5 in the 20-point adjustment in this process. On the JVC projector, there's picture and dark adjustments within the detailed gamma curve adjustments that you can make, and I would go into there and make adjustments on those until you get something close. In the JVC projector, typically I would start out with the picture adjustment, that's the strongest one, and try to get as close as possible, and then move the dark adjustments or the bright adjustments to try to get something to match. I would look at the James Bond scene where he's standing by the plane, and also at the black and white scene in James Bond, and make these fine adjustments within your flat panel or your projector to try to get that shading in the black and white scene and the color scene as close as possible at this point, while sort of ignoring the other color effects that are happening. I would also pay really close attention to the dark bar on the standard color bars and try to get that very close when you make these adjustments. That's going to show you how you're doing in the near black. I would also be very careful about making adjustments that the fine level in, like the LG where you have the 20-point adjustment, and making huge adjustments at one value and not making something in the next to it. You need to make these in a very smooth manner. One way to check this is by looking at this test pattern here of white bars and making sure that it's not getting more steppy looking or blocky looking than it did before you started this process. So you need to check everything you're doing as you do it with this shaded bar pattern so that you can see that you're not introducing blockiness into the image as you adjust gamma. So it's very important in this process to make sure when you start making fine adjustments to gamma that you really aren't hurting the bit depth or accuracy of the display in representing the image. In general, if you can avoid it, I would avoid making adjustments like the 20-point adjustment in the LG, because you're very likely to add noise to the image if you're not extremely careful in this. At this point, I'd go in and try to adjust the light output on the display to something that is pleasing to you. And so I'd pull up the image here on Casino Royale in the plane scene, and also I'd look at the black and white scene in Casino Royale and adjust the light output on the display until it's something that you find to be comfortable within the light level of your room. This is important for when we start to match the color of the display, that you'll want to get things in a reasonable way so that you get a reasonable level of color coming out of your display. We need to match the iPhone or iPad again to your display using the SMPTE color bars. We're now going to look at making finer adjustments for white balance or the color of white on your display. You should in your display be able to find where the settings are at for the more detailed white settings for color. These will be labeled something like gain or bias within the display, and usually under a color temperature setting or expert setting, something like that, where you can go in and make these fine adjustments. And we're going to look at this test pattern here that shows just a stepped white pattern from dark to bright. And these two controls work in a way such that one set of controls, the bias or the low adjustments, are going to affect the dark parts of the image, and the high or the gain adjustments are going to affect the bright part of the image. You want to try and make as small a moves as possible when adjusting this. And if you have a projector, I definitely would try to avoid moving the red adjustment at all. Most displays are red limited, so if you can make the adjustments with just the green and the blue controls on a projector, that's what I would do. If you have a flat panel, these comments really don't apply. So at this point, I would take your phone or iPad and compare it to your display and try to get as close as possible on the mid whites or the brighter parts of the whites with the gain controls within the display or the high controls for white balance. Once you've completed this, I would look at using the bias or the low adjustments to try to get the darker parts close to the proper value as possible. When you're correct on white balance, the near black should really look charcoal gray. And hopefully your phone looks charcoal gray in the near black so you can see that for comparison. You need to be very careful. Usually adjustments in the near black are not going to be that strong. And so if you start making adjustments, let's say 10 or 20 clicks from the default value, I'd be very suspicious of those moves on the bias controls or the low level controls on white balance. And once you make the adjustment at the low level, you may now need to go back and revisit the high level until you try to get a uniform looking white balance like you see on the phone or the iPad. We'll now move on to verifying these adjustments with the dark scene in Casino Royale. This is a black and white scene where we shouldn't see any color. And so if you see color in this, you may want to make some small adjustments within the bias controls or the low controls to try to get any color out of the near black. It's extremely easy to end up with color in the near black, and it's very annoying if this happens. So if you see a purplish tint or greenish tint or something to the near black, you really want to get rid of that, and you want to compare this to your phone or iPad to make sure that you're not seeing any color on your display in this image at all. If you can't get all the color out, that may not be wrong for your product. Not every product will track white perfectly, but as close as you can get as possible to not having obvious color, the better things are going to be. This completes our adjustments for white, and now we're ready to move on to part 5. We'll be adjusting the rest of the color in your display. Thanks for watching.